It was on one of those somber afternoons peculiar to London in the early spring, when the damp hangs low in the air and the streets glisten as though reluctant to dry, that I found Sherlock Holmes in one of his more pensive dispositions. The fire burned low in the grate, and though I had been halfway through a modest article in the Lancet, it was clear that Holmes's mind was engaged in more intricate considerations than anything my journal could offer. He stood at the window, his long figure silhouetted against the pale light, his gaze fixed upon the slow-moving life below. Outside, the rain tapped lightly against the panes with a sound not unlike that of a patient, but persistent visitor. "Do you observe?" he murmured without turning. "The gentleman with the grey umbrella who has paused by the lamp-post across the street." I rose to join him, my eyes seeking out the figure in question. "I see him," I replied, noting little remarkable about the man. Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "He is not, I think, here by accident. The narrative etched in his bearing tells us more than you suspect. The man beneath the umbrella was, at first glance, quite ordinary. Late middle age, well-dressed, though not ostentatiously so, his coat tailored in a fashion a few seasons behind current fashion, and his umbrella neatly furled though unused. He stood rigidly, as if torn between decision and retreat, glancing occasionally toward the door of our building, but never quite approaching. "He is a solicitor," said Holmes quietly. "Retired. Recently, I should think. Observe the ink stain near his thumb, the slight warp in the shoulders where a briefcase would rest. But look more closely at his countenance. Drawn, not with fatigue, but with guilt. A man revisiting some act he long hoped forgotten." "You deduce all this from mere posture and attire?" I asked, though long familiar with the clarity of Holmes's observations. "And more," Holmes continued. "He carries something in the breast of his coat. A photograph likely. There is a slight bulge, square, paper-bound. But he dare not part with it, else he would not stand there in the rain, deliberating." "Perhaps he simply lost his way," I offered. Holmes gave a soft, mirthless chuckle. "The lost man does not pause with such hesitancy before a familiar threshold. No, Watson, that man stands at the border of confession, and the abyss beyond it." At that precise moment, as if summoned by Holmes's very words, the man began to move, hesitantly at first, then with greater urgency. He crossed the street in hurried steps, shoulders hunched, his face pale beneath the brim of his hat. We watched in silence as he reached the base of our stairs, placed one hand upon the rail, and promptly collapsed without a sound. "Quickly, Watson," Holmes said, already striding toward the door. We descended together, and I bent to examine him. Though pale and clammy, his pulse was steady, and his breath labored but present. In his right hand, clenched with unconscious insistence, was a faded photograph, creased and mottled by time, the edges softened by years of handling. Holmes did not pry it from him. Instead, he studied the man's face with a gaze I had come to associate with some of his gravest cases. "We are no longer dealing with coincidence," he said quietly. "This man's past has finally found him, and it brings with it the weight of a buried sorrow." I glanced again at the photograph, barely visible through his fingers. "And that," I asked, "you believe to be the key?" Holmes did not answer. Between us we managed to bring the man into our sitting room, laying him gently upon the settee where many a troubled soul had sought Holmes's guidance. I fetched a glass of brandy while Holmes, with surprising delicacy, pried the photograph from the man's grasp. It depicted a young woman, her features softened by age and time's erosion. She stood before what appeared to be a country house, the shadows cast long by the afternoon sun. Around her neck hung a small locket, glinting faintly even through the degraded tones of the image. Holmes studied it for a full minute without a word. "It is not merely who she is," he murmured at last. It is what she represents, to him, and perhaps to others. There are ghosts in this picture, Watson, the kind that do not rest quietly. The man stirred faintly, murmuring a name. Clara, he whispered. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Then our mystery begins. The gentleman had been laid upon the settee, and I, with the practiced efficiency of a physician, set about loosening his collar, examining his pulse, and moistening his lips with a draught of brandy. He remained insensible for several minutes, his breathing shallow but regular, and a slight tremor coursed through his limbs as though he struggled beneath the weight of an unseen burden. Holmes stood a pace removed, arms crossed, his gaze fixed not upon the man's features, but upon his hands, the fingers whitened at the knuckles where they had clutched the photograph, now lying upon the small table beside him. He has known long years of restraint, Holmes observed, more to himself than to me. And now, at the moment when silence becomes impossible, the cost of speech overwhelms him. I made no reply, focused as I was on the man's condition, but I noted the remark, as I always did, for later reflection. At length, the man stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. There was a momentary confusion in his eyes, followed by the unmistakable expression of a man who wishes he had remained unconscious. I must apologize, he murmured weakly, struggling to sit upright. The weather, the strain. I did not mean to intrude so dramatically. Rest yourself, I replied gently. There is no need for apology. Holmes, meanwhile, offered no such comforts. He took a seat opposite the man, steepling his fingers with calm deliberation. You are among those accustomed to discretion, Holmes said. But today you have chosen confession. Let us begin with your name. The man hesitated, then replied with the voice of one who once commanded courtrooms, but now feared the weight of every syllable. Lionel Statham. I practiced law in the city for near 3 decades. I have been retired these past 7 years. My health required it, though, as you can see, my mind has not found peace. There was no need to state the obvious. The man's pallor and tremor spoke for themselves. Yet there was something more behind his demeanor, an inward collapse, not born of illness, but memory. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Very well, Mr. Statham. I believe we are both aware that you have not come to us for a matter of legality, but of something more intimate, and far older. Statham's hand trembled as he reached for the photograph upon the table. He took it up gently, as one might handle the belongings of the photograph upon the table. He took it up gently, as one might handle the belongings of the dead. You must understand, he said, voice low. This picture arrived 2 days ago by post, unsigned, unaccompanied, and unwelcome. It is nearly 30 years old, and yet I would know that face if all the world were reduced to ash. He handed it to Holmes, who took it without a word. The woman, Statham continued, was Clara Ashcroft. She was once very dear to me. Holmes examined the image in silence. I glanced over his shoulder and saw the same young woman, delicate features, a thoughtful expression, and that same locket at her throat. Though time had dimmed the ink, the emotion in her gaze remained. She died, Statham said. They called it drowning. She was found in the pond at her family's estate. The inquest ruled it suicide. But I never believed. He stopped abruptly, pressing his hand to his brow. And now this arrives, and with it, letters, phrases, half-threats that suggest there are those who know more, or pretend to. I cannot risk the scandal. Not now. Not when I have spent a lifetime rebuilding what was broken. Holmes tilted the photograph toward the firelight, studying the shadow that fell across the house behind Clara. You believe this is an attempt to blackmail you? He asked. I don't know what to believe, Statham whispered. Only that Clara's ghost has returned. and she brings a reckoning with her. Mr. Holmes, Statham said, leaning forward now, his voice hoarse with urgency. I beg you to understand, this cannot become public. I have a wife, grown children, a name long since cleared of youthful indiscretions. This matter must be resolved quietly, delicately. If scandal were to erupt, it would not merely tarnish me, it would destroy those I love. Holmes offered no immediate response. He turned the photograph over in his hands, noting a faint watermark on the back, nearly lost to age and wear. Even if what you fear is founded in falsehood, Holmes said at last, the perception of guilt may suffice to do harm, and you believe someone is deliberately provoking this, that there is an intent behind the reappearance of this image. Statham nodded. There is a venom in the words I have received. They are not random. Someone seeks to revive Clara's death, not to mourn her, but to unearth it for advantage. He swallowed hard, the veneer of composure slipping. I no longer trust my own memory. I no longer trust that I was blameless. Holmes's gaze shifted toward the fire. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, very well. But understand, Mr. Statham, truth rarely behaves discreetly. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his voice softened, yet sharpened by that peculiar edge he reserved for interviews of significance. You say you and Miss Ashcroft were once close. Were you engaged? Statham's eyes flickered. There was talk of it. We were young. I had ambitions. Her family disapproved. I allowed myself to be persuaded by circumstance. In other words, Holmes said coolly, you abandoned her. The remark struck not like an accusation, but a scalpel's incision. Statham flinched visibly. She never said it was over, he murmured. She simply stopped writing. Did you inquire after her? Number Y told myself she had moved on. Did she? There was no answer, only silence. Holmes tapped the edge of the photograph. This house, do you recall it? Yes, Statham said, recovering his voice with difficulty. It was her family's country property, Ashcroft Hall. I was there only once. And this locket? I remember it, he said slowly. She always wore it, said it had belonged to her mother. Holmes folded his hands. One final matter, these letters you received. Are they in Clara's hand? Number. But they quote her words, things only she could have written, or someone who read her correspondence. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. And your wife? He asked. Statham froze. She knows nothing of Clara. Holmes let that silence stretch long. At length, Holmes rose and paced once toward the hearth, then back again. He stood with his back to us, his eyes fixed upon the photograph now propped beside the lamp. You shall have your discretion, Mr. Statham, he said quietly, but not at the expense of clarity. The solicitor exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. As I watched my friend, however, I noted that rare, almost imperceptible tightening of his brow, the signal that, even as he accepted the case, something in the telling had unsettled him. Holmes suspected a lie. But from whom? It was 2 days later that Holmes and I made our way to the district of Richmond, where Mr. Lionel Statham resided in a modest but well-appointed home overlooking the river bend. The residence bore all the hallmarks of a man who valued order above ostentation, a manicured lawn, a polished brass knocker, and curtains drawn to an even line. Yet there lingered something airless about the place, a hush that extended beyond mere civility. Mrs. Statham received us in the vestibule with a measured courtesy, her smile warm but restrained, her gaze flickering once, briefly, toward her husband, with something that seemed akin to apprehension. She departed soon after showing us into the study, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender and a silence that pressed against the walls. It was here that Mr. Statham produced the original photograph once more, this time from a locked drawer in the escritoire. Though he said little as Holmes took it up, the act itself, placing the image into Holmes's care, appeared to cost him something. "My wife," he said after a pause, "believes you to be advising me on an old legal matter. I should be grateful if you allowed her to retain that belief." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Discretion," he said, "is a virtue we have cultivated with care." And with that, he turned the image toward the light with an expression that was both clinical and quietly reverent, as though the photograph held a secret that time had attempted but failed to erase. Holmes laid the photograph flat upon the desk and adjusted its angle, allowing the pale daylight to strike its surface evenly. He studied it in silence, and I, out of long habit, remained equally still, knowing better than to interrupt his process. "There is a peculiar balance to this composition," he murmured at last. "Note her posture, calm, dignified, yet not formal. She did not expect this photograph to be for public display. It was taken privately, perhaps as a memento or gesture of affection." He leaned closer, drawing out a small lens from his pocket and adjusting its focus over the surface of the image. "She wears a locket," he continued, "silver, with a clasped design I have seen but rarely. It is slightly off-center, as if she adjusted it in haste before the exposure. That suggests she dressed herself." I nodded. "And the building behind her?" Holmes tapped it lightly with a gloved finger. "That," he said, the gloved finger. "That," he said, "is no generic country dwelling. The window mouldings are of the Kentish Tudor style, but the decorative lintel work, note the scrolls, is peculiar to a subset of Highgate restorations in the 1830s. You believe you can identify the house from this alone?" "I do not believe, I expect," he replied. "There are perhaps a dozen such structures remaining. More if one considers those which have since been altered." He tilted the photograph slightly and frowned. "Do you observe this dark patch along the lower edge?" I did, though it seemed unremarkable. "Not shadow," Holmes said. "Discoloration, possibly from earth or damp, suggesting this photo was once buried or secreted where decay could reach it." He looked up at Statham. "This image was not merely forgotten, it was hidden." The following morning found us seated within the hushed interior of the London Records Office, its high shelves and narrow aisles whispering of lives long passed into obscurity. Holmes moved through the registries with an efficiency I'd grown to regard with admiration bordering on awe. He compared photographs, measured architectural notations, and cross-referenced land transfers with a quiet fervor I dared not interrupt. At last, he drew a single folio from the shelf and opened it across the table before us. "There," he said, pointing to an engraving. "Ashcroft Lane, Highgate, house number 22. The image showed the same mullioned windows and scrolling lintel that had featured so prominently behind Clara in the photograph. The inscription confirmed it as the former residence of one Edmund Ashcroft, deceased in 1871, survived by his only daughter, Clara. Holmes ran a finger down the margins of the page. "Sold in 1874 to a solicitor's firm. Vacant since 1882. Present ownership unknown." Perfect. I raised an eyebrow. Perfect for what? "For remaining untouched," he replied. "If someone recently entered that property, their tracks may still remain." By mid-afternoon, we stood before the iron gate of Ashcroft Lane. The house rose behind it in a state of genteel ruin, its upper windows shuttered, its garden wild with neglect. It was, in every sense, a house forgotten by time, but not, I suspected, by all. Holmes pressed one gloved hand to the latch. "Shall we enter, Watson?" The door yielded to Holmes's efforts with an ease that belied its outward appearance, and we stepped into a corridor that bore the chill of long abandonment. Dust lay thick upon the banisters and floorboards, and yet, curiously, certain patches near the threshold had been disturbed, as if someone had passed through with cautious haste. The parlour retained some vestige of its former elegance. A cracked mirror above the hearth, wallpaper faded to the hue of parchment, and a chaise in the corner, its upholstery gnawed by time. Holmes moved without sound, his gaze flickering over the room with the precision of a surgeon inspecting an open wound. "There," he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed dust before a bookcase. "And again. Scrape marks on the floorboards." He knelt and examined the floor more closely. Within moments, he had pried loose a single warped plank, beneath which lay a small cavity, blackened by damp and lined with torn fabric. At the center of it rested a delicate silver locket, its chain coiled like a sleeping serpent. He lifted it with care. Inside, beneath the glass, were several red strands of hair, still vivid despite the years. Holmes's expression darkened. "Clara's," he said. "It matches precisely the hue in the photograph. And this—" He paused, pointing to a smudge of fresh earth along the underside of the plank. "This cavity has been opened recently. Someone else has been here." I stepped back instinctively. Then we are not the only ones seeking answers. Holmes rose slowly. "No," he murmured. "But unlike our visitor, we do not fear what lies buried. On the contrary." He pocketed the locket with care. "We intend to unearth it." Holmes studied the locket in silence, its delicate hinge creaking faintly as he opened it. Inside, under the time-smudged glass, lay a small wisp of hair, red gold in hue, and still remarkably vibrant despite the years that must have elapsed since it had been tucked away. He held it beside the photograph, comparing tones with an eye that never wavered in its precision. "It matches," he said simply. "There can be little doubt that this belonged to Clara Ashcroft." The locket's surface was scratched and pitted, as if it had been handled with trembling hands, perhaps concealed in fear, perhaps recovered in secret. There was no inscription within, no initials or date, yet in its simplicity lay a quiet defiance, the kind borne by women whose truths were never allowed to speak plainly. Holmes returned it to the small cavity, brushing a gloved hand over the interior walls. "There is moisture here. The ground has been disturbed recently." "Then we are not the first to uncover it?" I asked. "On the contrary," he replied. "Someone came here to verify its presence, not to remove it." He looked toward the doorway, his brow drawn. That person already knew of the locket's existence, and perhaps feared what it confirmed. "What does it confirm?" "That Clara's memory is not dead, Watson. Not entirely. Someone seeks either to honor her, or to silence her voice a second time." He rose with care, his voice sharpening. "We must find someone who remembers her, someone whose mind remains tethered, however tenuously, to that distant tragedy." It was through the assistance of a parish ledger and a persistent inquiry at the Highgate almshouse that Holmes located Mrs. Letty Wren, once in service to the Ashcroft family. We found her seated in a narrow garden behind the residence, wrapped in a heavy shawl despite the mildness of the afternoon. Time had bowed her frame and scattered her thoughts like petals in the wind, yet her eyes retained the clear grey of someone who once watched quietly from the edges of things. "Miss Clara," she said when Holmes uttered the name. "Oh, yes. Yes, I remember her. So pretty, so soft-spoken, but sad too, always sad in the mornings." Holmes crouched beside her, speaking in a tone unusually gentle. "You served her for many years?" "7, she nodded. "From the year she came out, till the year she went into the water. And before she went," Holmes said carefully, "did she ever speak of anyone? A Mr. Statham?" Letty's gaze clouded. Oh, he was the gentleman. Tall, always in gloves, fine boots. Miss Clara, she kept his letters in her drawer, tied with blue ribbon. Do you recall anything else? The old woman blinked, her voice softening to a whisper. She wrote one last letter, but never sent it. I saw her holding it that morning. It had a red wax seal. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Do you know what became of it? But her mind had already drifted elsewhere, her eyes on a flower that no longer bloomed. As Holmes pressed gently, Letty Wren's voice descended into a series of murmurs and half-formed recollections, her mind wandering the corridors of time with halting steps. There was a child, she whispered suddenly, gripping her shawl tighter, with halting steps. There was a child, she whispered suddenly, gripping her shawl tighter. Not hers, they said, but it was. I know it was. Holmes stilled. A child, he asked, born to Miss Ashcroft. Letty nodded faintly. She was crying that night, said she couldn't keep him, said the gentleman would never know. I felt a chill that had little to do with the spring air. And the man? Holmes asked softly. The one with gloves, she replied. He came to the house after, not through the front. Never used the bell, always with gloves, even in summer. Miss Clara feared him. Holmes's eyes darkened, but he gave no voice to the thought forming behind them. And the letter? Gone, she muttered, like the child, vanished in the wind. She began to hum then, an old lullaby, disjointed and slow, as her eyes turned glassy and distant. We left her there, as one might leave a chapel, quietly, reverently. Holmes said nothing until we reached the gate. But I saw the tension in his hands. Something had shifted in his mind, something terrible and forming. It was on the third evening after our return from Highgate that Holmes, seated in his armchair with the photograph once again in hand, gave a sudden murmur of interest. I glanced up from my notes to find him adjusting the lens of his microscope with unusual delicacy. Observe, Watson, he said without turning. Just here, beneath the edge of the upper left margin. I leaned forward as he held the cardstock beneath the light. At first, I saw nothing but the uneven grain of age and wear, but under Holmes's magnifier there emerged, faint yet unmistakable, the ghost of a circular watermark. Griffin and Blythe, portraiture and daguerreotype, Holmes read aloud. Cheapside, 1859 to 1876. Defunct, I presume. Indeed, their studio was consumed in the same blaze that took half the block in 78. But the style of the inscription and the curvature of the embossing leave no doubt. This was their work. And what significance do you assign to that? Holmes gave a thin smile. It suggests that the photograph was neither personal nor amateur, Watson, but arranged. And if arranged, then the sitter expected permanence. Someone meant for this image to endure. And yet, it was buried. His gaze darkened. A contradiction always merits pursuit. Our inquiries led us 3 days hence to a narrow row house in Lambeth, where we were greeted by a Mr. Felix Blythe, aged, stooped, and near blind, but possessed of a memory as stubborn as a solicitor's ledger. Holmes had sent word in advance, and the old man received us with a cordiality befitting former patrons. Aye, Griffin passed some years ago, he said, settling himself beside the hearth. But I recall most sittings, Mr. Holmes. Faces stay longer than names, in my line. Holmes presented the photograph in its protective envelope, and Blythe took it with trembling fingers. This is my frame, he said at once. We used a 3/4 plate and satin board in that style. Yes, I remember her now. You do? Oh, yes. Not a common face. She came alone, booked under the name Miss Catherine James. But it was false. Her bearing was too fine. too sorrowful. Red hair, parted clean. Spoke like a girl trying not to cry. "Did she mention what the photograph was for?" Holmes asked. "She said it was for someone she loved, once." I did not pry. She asked me to remove the locket's shine in the final plate. I refused. "Why?" Blythe sighed. "Because she wept when I asked." There was a silence between us, broken only by the ticking of the old clock in the hall. "She never returned for the duplicate," he added quietly. "Someone else collected it. A man in gloves." Holmes's eyes flashed. Always the gloves. It was the following morning when Mr. Statham arrived once more at Baker Street, his composure frayed, his hand shaking with the effort to contain himself. He produced a folded sheet of stationery, unmarked by sender or seal, which Holmes took with delicate precision. The note was brief, barely 4 lines, but its contents were chilling. "You said I was your morning and your mercy, and yet you vanished when evening came. I was left with the silence and a secret that bore your name." Holmes read it aloud in a low voice. The effect on Statham was immediate. His face blanched, and he covered his mouth with his hand. "I wrote those words," he whispered, "not to her, but of her, in my journal. How could anyone know?" Holmes offered no answer, only laid the note beside the photograph and examined the ink with his lens. "No watermark," he murmured. "No fingerprints discernible, though the pen's nib was heavy. The hand is disguised." I watched as Holmes grew still. Too still. "This is not the work of a stranger," he said at last. "Someone with access to your private writings and an ear for memory. Someone who knows how to reopen old wounds with surgical precision." Upon our next visit to Richmond, it was Mrs. Statham who received us alone, her husband having taken to his bed with what she described as a constitutional headache. There was something in her manner that struck me at once, a quiet vigilance, as though every tick of the clock were another step toward revelation. Holmes, ever courteous, made polite inquiries regarding Mr. Statham's health. She answered with care, but her gaze flickered too often, first toward the staircase, then the window, then back to Holmes. "I am told you are assisting my husband with a legal matter," she said lightly. Holmes offered a neutral smile. Matters of the past do often present themselves in the guise of legality. Her hands twisted in her lap, and for a moment I thought she might ask more. Instead, she rose suddenly and offered tea, but her movement was abrupt, too much so, and as she reached for the bell pull, a letter fell from her sleeve. Holmes retrieved it for her, holding it just long enough to glimpse the handwriting. "An old note," she said quickly. "From my mother." He said nothing. But as she poured our tea, with hands too steady to be natural, I saw Holmes observing her not with suspicion, but with sorrow. Holmes and I spent a grey Tuesday morning at the Municipal Archives, that vast mausoleum of forgotten facts, where the lives of London's dead are reduced to ink and ledger. After several hours of careful search, Holmes paused before a faded entry in the coroner's register, his finger resting upon a familiar name. "Clara Ashcroft," he read. "Age 23, unmarried, deceased, October 3rd, 1874. Cause of death, drowning, following acute hysterical disturbance." He looked at me. "They called it madness," I said quietly. "They often do," he replied, "especially when it is love, grief, or betrayal." The report was brief and clinical. Clara had been found in the ornamental pond behind Ashcroft Hall. The physician noted no injuries, save a small bruise on the temple, likely sustained during the fall. A housemaid reported hearing Clara crying that night, but no danger was presumed. Holmes studied the marginalia. "No post-mortem," he said, and the body was interred without delay. Curious. "Too curious?" I asked. He did not answer at once. Instead, he removed a small notebook and jotted a phrase I could not see. "There is something missing, Watson," he said at last. "Something beneath the silence. This was not merely a tragedy. It was an erasure." And then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Let us examine the birth records next." In the adjoining register of births, we found the name Ashcroft appeared frequently, distant cousins and collateral lines. But nowhere was Clara's name attached to any child, neither as mother nor witness. Holmes scanned the records with increasing agitation, his pencil tapping the table in a steady rhythm. "She was pregnant," he said, more to himself than to me. The maid knew. Clara's last letter spoke of a secret. But there is no record. None. Could the child have been stillborn? Even then, Holmes said sharply, there would be a line, a certificate, some echo in the legal air. But here, nothing, not even silence, absence. He turned to me, his expression grim. "There is but one explanation. The child was either removed or concealed. And if so—" He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "Then someone alive today walks with Clara Ashcroft's blood and bears no knowledge of it. Or worse, someone does know and seeks to keep it buried." A long silence passed between us, as the enormity of the thought settled. Then Holmes stood, adjusting his gloves. "We must return to Richmond. If ghosts walk this case, Watson, they do so not to haunt, but to claim their inheritance." Holmes had always maintained that the truth, when properly dressed in fiction, could draw out what plain questioning could not. Accordingly, he composed a short and innocuous-seeming paragraph which appeared the next morning in the personal notices of the Times. "Certain parties possessing documentary proof relating to the 1874 matter concerning Miss C.A. of Highgate are invited to present claims via legal counsel. Descendant recently located. Entitlement pending probate confirmation." He folded the paper and laid it upon the mantel with a look of grim satisfaction. "That," he said, "should suffice to provoke a reaction." "But from whom?" I asked. "The field remains wide." "Precisely why the bait must be broad. Those with knowledge will recognize the initials and the implication. The reference to inheritance will strike only those for whom the matter is more than academic. And the risk? A calculated one. The photograph, Watson, is the key. If our adversary has seen it, they will move to erase it, or to confirm their suspicions." I studied his face. "You believe this case will turn not on discovery, but panic." "Many truths," he said, "are uncovered not through revelation, but through the desperate attempts to conceal them." That night, the trap was laid. It was shortly past midnight when we received the urgent summons from Richmond. By the time we arrived, the fire had been extinguished, the smoke still lingering in the upper corridor like a ghost reluctant to depart. Mrs. Statham stood pale and wordless in her nightgown, while her husband, shaken but unhurt, gestured us towards the study. The damage was contained to a single drawer. Within it, the charred remains of papers lay in fragile ruin, their edges curled and blackened. Among them was the photograph, now a brittle sheet of scorched ash, unrecognizable save for the faint outline of its original frame. Holmes crouched beside the debris with an expression that betrayed neither surprise nor alarm. "They came for this," he said, gently lifting the blackened relic with tweezers. "Nothing else has been touched. The silver was left, the cash drawer unopened. This was no robbery." "But who?" Statham asked hoarsely. "Who would wish to destroy something so old, so obscure?" Holmes did not answer at once. His eyes swept the room, alighting upon the window sash, where the lock had been forced with a thin, flat implement. "There was no theft," he murmured. "Only fear, and in fear lies revelation." He rose and turned to Statham. "We must speak plainly now. There are no more shadows to retreat into. Statham opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes had grown terribly tired. Holmes reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small envelope, sealed with wax. "I made a duplicate," he said, "2 days ago, enlarged and professionally treated. The original was always at risk." He handed it to Statham, who took it with hands that trembled visibly. Within was a near-perfect reproduction of the image. Clara's figure, poised and sorrowful, the locket still visible at her throat, and the architectural backdrop as clear as a fingerprint. The intruder did not act out of a desire to conceal this from the world, Holmes continued. They sought to know what we knew, to verify that the image existed, and that its meaning had not been lost. But why burn it then? To ensure no second gaze would follow. To silence the possibility of further eyes studying her face, her pose, her surroundings. And yet... He paused, tapping the copy thoughtfully. They did not take it with them. They left its ashes here, as one buries a threat. Statham sat heavily in the chair beside the hearth, the photograph pressed to his chest. "Why now?" he whispered. "After all these years?" Holmes's voice was soft. "Because ghosts, once stirred, do not return willingly to their graves." Holmes paced slowly before the cold hearth, his hands clasped behind his back in that familiar pose, which signaled deep and deliberate reasoning. "There are crimes of passion," he said, "crimes of greed, and crimes of convenience. But this, Watson, this is a crime of fear." I watched as he paused and gestured toward the burnt drawer. Our intruder did not come armed, did not ransack the premises, and touch nothing of value. Their aim was singular, the photograph. He turned to Statham, who looked up, hollow-eyed. Someone saw Clara Ashcroft in that image, saw her, not as a forgotten name, but as a threat. They recognized the photograph not as relic, but as proof. "Proof of what?" I asked. "Of connection," Holmes replied. "Of legacy, perhaps even of liability." The image raised questions long buried, and whoever feared those questions most came here to answer them for themselves. He looked at me. "Consider this. If Clara's child had lived, what might they resemble? Whom might they challenge? And who would stand to lose if that truth came to light?" The implications turned in my mind like keys in a lock. For the first time, I sensed how much remained concealed in the dark. It was well after the hour when Holmes and I remained alone with Mr. Statham in the drawing room, the embers low in the grate, and the air heavy with what had not yet been said. He sat forward, his hands clasped, his voice roughened by time and guilt. "I loved her," he said quietly. "Clara Ashcroft. We were engaged in secret, foolish, romantic, headstrong. I was 20, newly called to the bar. She, 17, full of light. She, 17, full of light. Her father forbade it. My family insisted I think of my prospects." He looked down at his hands. "I chose ambition." "And Clara?" Holmes asked gently. "She wrote at first. I ignored them. Then I heard she'd taken ill. Nervous troubles, they said. And later still, her death." He swallowed hard. "I told myself it was grief, and nothing more. That I had wounded her heart, but not her soul. But I never went to her grave. I never answered her final letter, if one was sent." He turned toward the burnt drawer. "And now I find that the past did not bury itself. It waits. It waits in ash and locket and ink. And I no longer know whether I was cruel or cowardly." Holmes did not answer. There was in truth no need. "The child," Statham whispered, as if the very word might fracture the silence further. "I swear to you, I never knew. If she carried my child, I was ignorant of it." His voice caught. "To think that such a life might have begun and vanished, and I stood blind beside it. Holmes stepped forward, his tone firm but not unkind. The child may not have vanished. The absence of record does not confirm death. It may confirm concealment. Statham looked up slowly. You believe the child lives. I believe someone believes it, Holmes said. And belief in such matters is motive enough. The colour drained from the old man's face. He turned toward the window, as if hoping the answer might lie somewhere beyond the glass and smoke. If so, he murmured, then I have fathered not only guilt, but danger. Holmes said nothing, but I felt in that moment that the case had ceased to be about memory and become something living. It was a curious assembly that gathered that damp afternoon within the modest parlour of Baker Street. Holmes had sent invitations under the guise of a final clarification of legal ambiguities, and now the sitting room bore witness to an uneasy congregation. Mr. and Mrs. Statham arrived first, he subdued, she restless. Mrs. Wren was ushered in shortly after by Holmes himself, her step halting, her gaze flitting with age and confusion. Then came Jonathan Baines, tall, composed, with a mouth that smiled more often than the eyes warranted. Holmes offered no explanations, only quiet courtesies and tea. I have asked you all here, he began, because there are truths which, like dust beneath a carpet, cannot remain forever trodden down without consequence. Today we lift that carpet. Baines shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. Holmes ignored him and turned to Mrs. Wren with surprising gentleness. You once spoke of a letter, madam, a letter that never reached its destination. The old woman blinked, then nodded slowly. In the blue box, sir. I hid it from the mistress's mother. She would have burned it. Holmes inclined his head and retrieved a folded paper from beneath the mantel. I believe this is it. Holmes held the letter with care, its creases yellowed by years and its ink faded, yet still legible to those who wished to see. He read it aloud, and the room grew still. Lionel, I do not write in anger, though I have every right. I write because there is within me something of you, something not yet born, but real all the same. I shall not beg you to return. I only wish for you to know that what we shared was not fruitless. If this letter reaches you, know that I forgave you the moment you left, but I will not let our child grow in shame or secrecy. I will name you because truth deserves a name. The silence that followed was weighty. Mr. Statham had sunk back into the armchair, his brow pressed to his hand. His wife stared straight ahead, lips parted but voiceless. Where was this found? Baines asked, his voice calm, too calm. In the blue velvet box, Holmes replied. With the locket, beneath a floorboard in Ashcroft House. Mrs. Wren preserved it, against every order. Holmes turned now to Mr. Statham. You were named, sir, not in court or in shame, but in hope, and that hope was born. I confess that, until that moment, even I had not grasped the full trajectory of Holmes's deductions. But as he stepped to the mantel and took down a framed photograph of a young man, Samuel, the Statham's ward, I felt the breath catch in my chest. This, said Holmes, is Clara's child. Mrs. Statham uttered a small cry. Mr. Statham looked up, aghast. No, he said faintly. That cannot be. Holmes did not soften his tone. You took Samuel in as a charitable case through a church intermediary, did you not? Yes, but he was an orphan. Indeed. An orphan whose baptismal record bore only a mother's name. C. Ashcroft. You were told it was coincidence. You believed it. But I did not. He handed Mr. Statham a parchment. This is the church registry from St. Bartholomew's home. The mother, Clara Ashcroft. No father listed. The child was given over within 2 weeks of birth. No formal adoption followed, only a guardianship arrangement. And so, through the passage of compassion or fate, You unknowingly raised your own son. The old man stared at the paper, his hand trembling. My God, he whispered. All this time under my roof. Mrs. Statham wept quietly. A hand pressed to her lips. He has your eyes, Holmes said softly. And indeed, as I looked again at the photograph, I could no longer deny the resemblance, not merely of feature, but of something deeper. You may wonder, Holmes continued, how I confirmed the link before confronting you all. The answer lies not in documents, but in reaction. He turned his gaze to Jonathan Baines, whose posture had stiffened noticeably. I arranged a quiet luncheon at Simpson's. Young Samuel was invited under the pretext of meeting a benefactor. You, Mr. Baines, were told of a possible claimant to Clara's estate. Baines said nothing. You arrived second. You saw him seated at the far table, his hair dark, his brow familiar, the tilt of his jaw unmistakably hers. And you turned on your heel and fled before dessert. I was unwell, Baines said stiffly. You were afraid, Holmes corrected, because in him you saw Clara returned, not in person, but in consequence. You realized that your hold on the estate was crumbling, not through litigation, but lineage. Baines's eyes flashed, but he did not speak. The child was never meant to reappear, Holmes added. You believed him vanished, erased by time, and yet there he sat, alive, educated, and, through no one's intent, placed within the very family that had forsaken his mother. There was a long, bitter pause. You recognized him, Mr. Baines, Holmes said quietly, because you helped bury the truth. Holmes approached the final layer of revelation with a slow precision, as though pulling back the final cloth on a long-concealed tableau. When Clara died, he said, her modest estate passed to her nearest legal relative, Jonathan Baines. You were appointed executor. As such, you controlled the remnants of her holdings, a modest sum in trust, a few possessions, and a small parcel of land still untouched in Ashcroft Lane. Baines gave a dismissive gesture. A trifling inheritance. Trifling until contested, Holmes said. And when my newspaper notice suggested the presence of a living heir, you did not sleep. He paced slightly, then turned toward the fire. You forged the anonymous letters. You quoted Clara's words to unnerve Mr. Statham, hoping to rattle him into silence or retreat. You broke into his study and burned the photograph not to destroy evidence, but to see if what we had matched what you feared. Holmes opened a ledger and laid it upon the table. These are withdrawal records from the estate trust, small but steady, all routed through your firm, all under your discretion. You feared that discovery of the child would not only strip your control, but expose impropriety. Baines's face had lost its color. You forged nothing, Holmes said, except the illusion of finality. Clara's child was never dead, only displaced, and your campaign began the moment you saw in Samuel, the ghost of your guilt. No one spoke. The only sound was the whisper of Mrs. Wren, who murmured, "Justice comes when it is ready." The fire in Baker Street crackled low, casting an amber hue across the assembled faces, each one shadowed by expectation or fear. Mr. and Mrs. Statham sat close together, his hands clasped tightly, hers fidgeting with a fraying handkerchief. Jonathan Baines had claimed a position near the window, aloof yet alert, his chin slightly lifted in a posture of bland curiosity. Mrs. Wren, stooped and murmuring to herself, occupied a corner armchair, a living relic of a vanished past. Holmes stood beside the hearth, one hand resting upon the mantelpiece, the other behind his back. "I have summoned you all," he began, his voice measured and void of ornament, "not to cast judgment, but to illuminate. What has been buried must now be unearthed, if we are to prevent further darkness." No one responded. There are those in this room, Holmes continued, who have spent decades stitching silence into the fabric of their lives. But silence, like decay, spreads, and it leaves behind the scent of guilt. I felt, as I so often had in such moments, that we stood not merely in our lodgings, but upon a precipice, the ledge between revelation and ruin. And at its edge, Holmes, calm and unshaken, held the lantern. Baines offered a tight smile, as though indulging the fancies of an eccentric host. "You weave a compelling tale, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but surely even you must admit that what you possess is conjecture, emotionally colored inference, not legal substance." Holmes did not move from his place by the hearth. "You are mistaken, Mr. Baines. What I possess is motive, opportunity, and now, intent." Baines shrugged faintly. "A letter unsigned. A vague recollection from a maid whose memory is all but air. A boy of no legal standing. And your entire theory rests on a coincidence that the Statham's ward is, by chance, the son of a woman Mr. Statham once loved." Holmes turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. A curious choice of phrase. "I never said she was once loved, only known." Baines's mouth opened, then shut again. "Coincidence," Holmes continued, "is the last refuge of a man cornered by truth." "I deny any wrongdoing," Baines replied coolly. "You may paint me with suspicion, but it will not stand." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "You mistake me again. I do not paint, Mr. Baines. I unveil." The stillness that followed was no longer of civility, but of fracture, hairline cracks forming in a brittle facade. It was then Holmes inclined his head toward me, and I stepped forward with the weathered volume held respectfully in my hands. "This," I said, "was found yesterday among a collection of sealed boxes in the attic storage of the late Mrs. Baines's country property." The boxes had remained untouched for decades, until Holmes, ever curious, suggested a revisit. Baines's gaze sharpened. "The diary," I continued, "bears Clara Ashcroft's hand and spans the final months of her life. It is filled with detail, her loneliness, her reflections, and above all, her maternal longing. She speaks of the child often, and always with tenderness." I opened the diary to a bookmarked page, my voice steady. "I will not give him to the river. I will not vanish like my father warned me I must. If I must leave this place, it will be with the child and not without. Jonathan says there are legalities, that the name must not be known, but I do not care. I shall go, far from Ashcroft, and make a new name, for the boy and myself." Holmes took the diary gently from my hand and placed it upon the center table. "In her words, Mr. Baines, you are present, and you are feared." Holmes opened the diary once more and began to read in a voice stripped of drama, leaving only the bare clarity of truth. "Jonathan says I imagine too much, but I see how he looks when I speak of the child. I see how he walks past the cradle, with his gaze averted. I know that he has spoken with the family solicitor, though he denies it. I will leave by the new moon. I cannot trust him, and I do not want the child raised by a man who believes in erasure." As Holmes read on, Baines shifted in his seat. The rigid posture, so proudly maintained earlier, had begun to fray. A muscle twitched at his jaw. His fingers clutched at the arms of the chair, whitening at the knuckles. "She feared you," Holmes said softly, closing the book. "And that fear, voiced in private, now speaks before us all." Baines stood suddenly, knocking the chair back. "This is character defamation. You have no proof. None." Holmes took a step forward. "But I do have her voice, and that, Mr. Baines, is more damning than your silence." Baines turned, perhaps to flee, but found no exit, not from the room, nor from the past that had caught him at last. There was a long, suspended hush. Then Baines lowered himself back into his chair, as though his limbs could no longer support him. "I never meant for her to die," he muttered, voice brittle. "Only to vanish. The water, it was meant as a story, not a grave." No one moved. She would have ruined everything. Her scandal, her stubbornness, that cursed child. I forged the scene, told them she ran to the river, and then I waited." He buried his face in his hands. "She was gone. I thought it over. I thought I had won. But in the hush that followed, no one believed he had." It was late when we returned to Baker Street, the city muffled in fog, and the streets glistening with the residue of a recent rain. Within our old sitting room, the fire was rekindled, our armchairs resumed, and the echoes of the evening's revelations slowly began to settle into silence. Holmes, ever contemplative after the unraveling of a great tangle, leaned back with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his gaze fixed on the ceiling yet seeing far beyond it. I busied myself at the cabinet, pouring each of us a measure of brandy, and handed him a glass, which he accepted without a word. The room seemed unchanged, which he accepted without a word. The room seemed unchanged. The same scatter of monographs and newsprint, the scent of tobacco lingering in the drapery, and the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Yet something indefinable had shifted, as if the case had etched itself into the grain of the wood and the shadows of the room. At length Holmes stirred, turning his eyes to me with that peculiar brightness they assumed when his mind returned from its far-flung orbit. "You perceive, Watson," he said quietly, "how the truth, though long buried, has a way of clawing to the surface." "There was a chain, Watson," Holmes began, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, "as deliberate as any I have observed." He rose and paced to the mantel, the energy of explanation lending him fresh animation. "We began with a photograph, a common enough object, yet from it emerged a world. The studio watermark, faint as moth breath, gave us our first lead. The recollection of a red-haired woman booking a session under an alias, an anomaly in its time, suggestive of subterfuge, confirmed that this image was not preserved by chance. Then came the house in Highgate. That we found the locket there was no coincidence. It had been hidden, Watson, not discarded. Its contents, strands of red hair, tied our faded photograph to a woman long lost, Clara Ashcroft. Holmes paused, then continued. And the maid, Mrs. Wren, though addled by time, handed us a cipher of truths. The man with gloves, a letter never sent, a child who vanished. Each clue, obscure when alone, became coherent when joined. The trap, as you know, was the announcement of the fictitious heir, an inheritance reclaimed, that provoked the guilty party to act. The photograph's destruction revealed not malice, but fear. A man does not burn what he does not understand. He burns what he knows. He turned back to me. Baines's panic at the sight of young Samuel was the fulcrum. From there, the inheritance scheme unraveled. His control over Clara's estate, his fear of losing it, was the root of every deception. Holmes returned to his seat with a sigh. It was not a case of murder, Watson. It was a case of erasure, a life unacknowledged, a woman dismissed, a child almost forgotten. But truth, like the photograph, though faded, remained. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingertips pressed together. But what gives the matter its most singular character, Watson, is not Baines's villainy, but Mr. Statham's unwitting virtue. I looked at him askance. You refer to the boy, Samuel? Precisely, said Holmes. The irony is absolute. Mr. Statham, fearful of scandal, of past indiscretion, of the long arm of an abandoned affair, adopted the very child he had sought to distance himself from. I sat in momentary silence, the magnitude of it settling upon me. The child, born in secret, was placed under another name into charitable care. And years later, in a gesture of Christian duty, Statham brought the boy into his household, clothed him, educated him, protected him. He raised his own son, I murmured, believing him to be no more than a stranger. Holmes nodded, and did so with a devotion unmarred by knowledge. It is a strange mercy, Watson, a quiet justice, unsought and perhaps undeserved, but justice all the same. There was something profoundly moving in the thought, more than the resolution of clues, more than the unmasking of a scoundrel. A life redeemed not by design, but by unknowing care. It was, I thought, the kind of truth Holmes seldom spoke of, but in his own fashion held dear. The hour had grown late, and the city beyond our windows lay in a hush of fog and lamplight. Holmes, staring into the fire, spoke with the air of a man reflecting not merely upon a case, but upon the frailty of human design. "You see, Watson," he said, "not all justice arrives wrapped in the robes of law. There are wrongs no magistrate can prosecute, wounds no tribunal can mend. What passed between Clara Ashcroft and Mr. Statham, between her memory and the boy who now bears his name, exists in a place the law cannot tread." I nodded, the embers stirring soft red against the grate. "Baines will answer," Holmes continued, "for his fraud and his forgery, perhaps more. But the greater reckonings lie elsewhere, in Mr. Statham's conscience, in his wife's silent dread, in the boy, Samuel, who shall one day learn the truth of his origin, and must choose what to do with it." He paused. "The courts will not see all of this, but truth, like the tide, reaches where no gavel can echo." Holmes reached for his pipe then, a gesture familiar and final, and lit it with the taper by his chair. "We are not judges, Watson, but we bear witness, and sometimes that, too, is justice." There was little more to say. The case had closed not with applause, but with silence, and in that silence something was set right, not by verdict, but by the quiet work of truth finding its voice at last. It was some days after the conclusion of the case when Holmes suggested we take a walk along the embankment, the air thick with mist and the sluggish Thames rolling darkly beside us. The world had resumed its ordinary rhythm, yet the echoes of that singular investigation lingered still. We walked in silence for a time, the clop of distant hooves softened by fog, until Holmes broke it with a quiet murmur. "There are cases, Watson," he said, "which leave no man triumphant, only thoughtful." I nodded, understanding the sentiment too well. The memory of Baines's unravelling, of Mr. Statham's haunted eyes, and of young Samuel, so full of trust and unknowing lineage, pressed heavily on my mind. "Would you say justice was served?" I asked him, more to provoke his reasoning than to form a conclusion of my own. Holmes did not answer immediately. He drew from his coat the familiar briar, and lit it with deliberate slowness. "I would say," he replied at last, "that justice, like the river, flows without haste or concern for our verdicts. We may observe it, we may even steer it briefly, but it runs to its own destination." As we passed beneath the gas lamp's flickering glow, I found myself possessed of an odd tenderness toward the quiet mercy that had threaded its way through the case. "How strange," I said aloud, "that the child born of secrecy and misfortune should find himself raised not by strangers, but by the very man whose name he never knew he bore." Holmes glanced at me sidelong. "Strange to the careless mind, Watson, but perhaps not to fate." "There is something redemptive in it," I continued, struggling to give voice to the sentiment that had taken hold of me. "Mr. Statham, who once fled from scandal, became, unknowingly, a guardian of what remained of Clara's life. And in return, the boy grew under a roof, not of disgrace, but of kindness. It was no design of man," Holmes said, "but it was no error either. The notion stirred something solemn within me. We so often chase truth like hounds behind a scent, measuring it in facts and motives. Yet here was a truth wrought not by logic, but by accident, and it had brought forth something nobler than any courtroom decree. For once, the past had not been avenged, but transformed. Holmes halted by the parapet and leaned slightly upon it, gazing across the sluggish, darkening waters. His voice, when he spoke, was low and almost philosophical in tone. "There is a mask, Watson," he said, "beneath which justice and cruelty often wear the same expression." I looked to him in surprise, but he did not meet my eyes. Instead, he studied the river with an abstraction that suggested his thoughts had drifted far beyond the present hour. We speak of justice as though it were a blade, clean, sharp, precise. But what if it is, in truth, a mirror cracked by time? We see ourselves in it, but not always clearly. "You refer to Baines?" I asked. "I refer to them all," Holmes replied. "To Clara Ashcroft, to Statham, to the boy, each bearing the consequences of a single action, some with knowledge, others without. Baines wore cruelty like a cloak. But who among them did not conceal something?" He paused and drew slowly from his pipe. "In the end, we do not recover the whole. We gather fragments, a photograph, a letter, a locket, and from these we construct what once was whole, but it is always incomplete." He turned to me at last. "It is not who committed the act that matters most. It is who bore its weight, and that, Watson, is where the true reckoning lies." We resumed our stroll, though neither of us spoke for several moments. The rhythm of our footsteps, the ripple of the tide, and the distant creak of a passing barge composed a kind of muted requiem. My thoughts turned, as they often did in such moments, to memory. Not the grand memory recorded in ledgers or tribunals, but the quieter sort preserved in hearts and attics, in diaries tucked away and photographs grown dim. That faded image, Clara's solemn face, the locket at her throat, the uncertain background behind her, had been our doorway. It offered no accusation, no plea, only presence. And in its stillness, it had drawn the living and the dead together once more. Baines would face the consequences of his forgery and deceit, though I suspected the punishment would pale beside the inward ruin. Mr. Statham, for his part, had glimpsed at last the full circle of his past, not with triumph, but with trembling grace. As for Samuel, he would grow into a man marked not by shame, but by something deeper, a mystery, not of guilt, but of mercy. And Holmes? He had returned, as ever, to his violin and his silence. But I knew the case had reached him. He had once told me that a single human life, rightly observed, was more intricate than any cipher. And so I closed this account, not with verdict, but with a thought. Some truths live only in fragments, and some sentences, unlike law, are passed quietly in the hearts of those who remember. As we returned to Baker Street that evening, I observed Holmes seated once more in his armchair, fingers steepled, his gaze distant, yet sharp. "It is a peculiar thing, Watson," he said quietly, "how time rarely hides the truth. It may bury it beneath sentiment, propriety, or silence, but it does not destroy it. In the end, the truth has its own tide." He turned to me then. "The cruelest acts are not always committed with malice, but with indifference. And in that indifferent silence, lives are shaped, destinies redirected. A photograph fades, Watson, but guilt remains vivid. Tell me this, dear listener. What do you believe was the true turning point in this case? Was it the forgotten letter, the hidden child, or the conscience of a man long silent? Share your thoughts in the comments below.